The process of localizing a game has its fair share of obstacles, especially in the form of marketing. How do you take a game that was already niche to begin with in Japan and try to make it a success in Western territories? Some Western publishers took that question a bit too far for fear of not making enough return on their investment, and you'll see how soon. Nowadays, that question isn't so threatening, because now we have more publishers who are serious about maintaining a game's identity, especially publishers who simply opened Western branches of their own company. Plus, every niche genre has fans who are constantly in the know, and viral marketing can potentially turn a niche game into an overnight success. Social media has been a big boon for more obscure titles that way. For example, viral social media posts is how Yakuza 0 was able to explode in popularity. The clip of Kiryu meeting Nugget the chicken and then hiring the animal to be a realtor was the first domino that fell, which helped turn Like a Dragon into a successful IP and one of Sega's most important franchises in the West, to the point where they consider it as important to them as Persona and Sonic the Hedgehog. Unfortunately though, that safety net wasn't always there. Game industry marketing is fairly often perceived as a regular villain, particularly when they're given power over the actual developers. From awful trailers to straight up trying to force the studio to add some marketable aspects to their game, usually multiplayer, the marketing team for a big publisher is sometimes seen as pure interference, a roadblock to creative vision, and sometimes even a roadblock to success, in spite of their purpose. Sometimes a publisher is so obsessed with marketing and it interferes so deeply that it straight up ruins a game's identity, especially back in the days when some random Western company scoops up the license for a Japanese game they don't really care about, probably because it was cheap. There's a specific type of marketing-induced change that regularly pops up and causes a discussion: box art. We've seen the changes between Japanese and North American box art before. Changes from a beautiful but gloomy and strangely liminal landscape to an awkward close-up of the main character, or happy Kirby to angry Kirby. These changes, whether they're big or small, are made to maximize the appeal to the audience of a particular region at a glance. Sometimes they might work, but what if the box art changes go too far? Or rather, what if changing the box art isn't all that they do? What if the North American publisher of a Japanese game tried to completely obfuscate the outward identity of a game so that it was impossible to tell just from looking at it that it was Japanese? That might sound like complete overkill, right? But it happened. Now, this isn't to say that changing a game in the overseas release is a recent concept. It happened plenty of times back in the NES days too. Sometimes it was the Japanese publisher doing it to their own games. Probably the most famous example is Super Mario Bros. 2, which was originally a game called Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, created with the specific purpose of promoting Yume Kojo 87, a special television event sponsored by Fuji TV to market a slew of new media they were releasing at the time. The first sequel to Super Mario Bros. Was supposed to be The Lost Levels, but it was deemed too similar to the first game and too difficult for Western players, so Nintendo simply grabbed Doki Doki Panic and gave it the visual and mechanical changes necessary for it to be a proper Mario game, or as proper as they could get it without completely remaking it. Another example of this is Alex Kidd High-Tech World for the Sega Master System, which was originally an Anmitsuhime game released in 1987 before it was reworked into an Alex Kidd title and released overseas in 1989. But those examples are a bit less extreme because they were still published overseas by Nintendo and Sega themselves, respectively. There was no shady middleman here. Sadly, I can't say the same for other games. You would think this practice would grow rarer as time went on, but it persisted another 20 or so years, especially with changes made in order to try and distance the game from its Japanese origins, at least on the surface. You wouldn't really be able to tell the game was made by a Japanese studio until you started the game, or at least saw a bunch of Japanese names in the credits. So, what were these later games? Let's start with what are probably the most famous examples for this era. Mobile Light Force 1 and 2 for the PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 respectively. These games were published outside of Japan by XS Games, and you can already tell just by looking at the cover art and realizing they are literally the same picture with a slight shift in color tint, this is going to be a doozy. Just from these covers, you would assume the games are about some badass Charlie's Angels like femme fatales or something, but no, they're not that at all, not by a long shot. Mobile Light Force 1 is actually a vertically scrolling shoot-'em-up called Gunbird, developed by Seiichi, who also published the game in Japan. The game first released in Japanese arcades back in 1994, followed by a Japanese Sega Saturn and PS1 release in '95. The game wouldn't be brought to overseas home consoles until 2003, when it was crudely localized, and I use that term very lightly, as Mobile Light Force. For anyone not familiar with this whole situation, you may assume that Mobile Light Force 2 must be Gunbird 2 then, right? Well, no, it isn't. The sequel, Mobile Light Force 2, is actually Castle of Shikigami, another shoot-'em-up developed by Alpha System and originally published in Japan by Taito. It first released in Japanese arcades in 2001, and XS Games published it overseas also in 2003, the same day as Mobile Light Force 1. XS Games released both games at the same time. It's pretty clear what they were trying to do. They swiped up a couple of niche games in the same genre and crudely changed their identity to fool unsuspecting Western gamers into thinking they were related to each other, but they weren't. Even worse, XS Games tried to hide this fact by straight up removing the entire story of both games on top of also removing some game modes. Not only were these games from different franchises, they weren't even made by the same studio or even published by the same company in their native country of Japan. And of course, people who bought these games weren't even convinced by any of this deception, because any fan of shoot-'em-ups worth their salt would have kept up with the news and known what these games actually were. Even if they didn't, it was clear that their actual content did not match the box art. This isn't even the only time XS Games did this. They somewhat changed the identities of other games, such as Jigsaw Island Japan Graffiti to Jigsaw Madness, and Prism Land Story to Sorcerer's Maze. These were pretty bad too, but the whole Mobile Light Force debacle was by far their most egregious modifications. And to make things even more confusing, XS Games would go on to publish Castle of Shikigami 2 in North America with its proper title, dropping the ridiculous Mobile Light Force name one game too late. Castle of Shikigami 1 and 2 have nothing to do with Gunbird, but thanks to their weird attempt at localization, it's flipped around so that, based on appearance, Mobile Light Force 1 and 2 have nothing to do with Castle of Shikigami 2, so in the West, it's a sequel to nothing. Pretty head-scratching. Now, it still doesn't stop there. There's more instances where Japanese games get a ridiculous makeover, presumably in an effort to make them look more appealing to whatever their target demographic is in the West. I understand why this might seem like a necessity for some games, but more often than not, the execution ends up making the game look like generic shovelware slapped together in a week. If you want some examples of this, then look no further than the Imagine series by Ubisoft. Yes, Ubisoft contributed to this weird trend. Shocker. In case you never stumbled upon this series before, Ubisoft's line of Imagine titles were primarily on the DS and 3DS handhelds aimed at young girls between the ages of 6 and 14. From what I can tell, most games in the series were made by Western developers, some of whom were working in-house at Ubisoft. However, a few specific titles were actually Japanese otome games that Ubisoft snatched up a license for and then put a generic-looking paper bag over their heads. Now, I don't know about you, but based on what I've seen over the last 10 years or so, there's definitely been some semblance of a trend of teenage to young adult women just naturally gravitating towards games of this nature without the need for this weird genericization. But hey, I don't deny the possibility that these games probably opened the eyes of some curious girl somewhere. First game I'll discuss here is Imagine Figure Skater, which was originally released in Japan as part of the Kuru Kuru Princess series in March 2007. It was developed by Spike, who would later merge with Chunsoft to create, well, Spike Chunsoft. As you might expect, the game is about taking control of a young figure skater trying to make it into the big leagues. You practice new moves, purchase new equipment, outfits, and accessories, play mini-games that increase your stats, and hang out in a strangely Japanese-looking city with characters who have very traditional Japanese names like Kevin, Molly, and Isabel. Now, for what it's worth, I don't think the game is bad. It's not a particularly huge revelation in the genre of RPG sports games, but it's very digestible and lighthearted entertainment. I'm sure there's a few girls who had the path to otome games unlocked before them thanks to this title. Figure Skater would soon receive a sequel called Imagine Ice Champions. It originally released in Japan as another Kuru Kuru Princess game in December 2007, but it wouldn't make its way west until February 2009. The next game of the Imagine series I'm going to touch on is Imagine Makeup Artist, which originally released in Japan as Cosmetic Paradise Meiku no Kiseki in July 2008. This was developed by Global A Entertainment, a studio that was quite small but managed to pump out multiple games a year. As far as I can tell, they were never larger than maybe a few dozen employees. It hit the West in May 2009 and did not really take the region by storm. Makeup Artist is what you're likely expecting. You play as a girl who offers top-tier makeup services, and depending on your client's wishes, you apply the respective makeup in the minigame. One thing that stands out in Makeup Artist, though, is the altered character designs. Figure Skater and Ice Champions did not seem to take many, if any, artistic liberties with how characters looked, but many characters in Makeup Artist were changed, especially the love interests. They were all made to look decidedly less anime, because of course. And the last game in the Imagine series I'm going to touch on is Imagine Ballet Dancer, another title developed by Spike. This one has the unique distinction, however, of releasing in North America a month before Japan in November, then December of 2008. In Japan, it's titled Princess Ballerina: The Four Dreamy Prima Donnas, or Dreaming Prima Donnas. My Japanese is still pretty bad. It's got the same basic premise as the ice skating games, but with ballet instead. Pretty simple. Now, drastic identity obfuscating localization like these games are much rarer now, but it was an issue that went under the radar for a while. In the case of Ubisoft's Imagine series, it's mostly the genericization that makes the product look bad. I understand the visual change to hopefully appeal to young Western girls, but strictly looking at the bland, uninspiring covers, no one would be blamed for thinking these games were Ninja Bread Man level shovelware. In the case of XS Games and their treatment of Gunbird and Castle of Shikigami, however, their attempt to tie two completely unrelated games together was a very poor attempt at trying to trick the consumer into doubling up on purchases. Because if a game and its supposed sequel came out at the same time, then maybe it's a better value to just get both, right? Strictly from a business perspective, I suppose it's understandable why they would do that, shadiness aside. But once you learn that they went so far as to completely gut the actual content of the game to hide the fact that they're not related at all, it goes from being a shrewd business decision to actively making the product worse and being downright disrespectful to the people who actually made it. It was a weird era of gaming for sure. Thankfully, since then, more Japanese publishers have either established their own branches in other countries or created partnerships with Western publishers who hopefully take their work more seriously, to avoid these weird and excessive liberties being taken with their games. In an online age where fans of any genre or franchise could easily find out about this stuff, it seems like a good idea to, not mess with the vision too much. This concludes my video on secret Japanese games. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.